Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Java Basics. Today we're going to be talking about random numbers. Now random numbers are critical in any kind of game development. In Java there are two ways to generate random numbers. We're going to cover both in this video. So let's get started. If you want to learn Java programming or just programming in general, subscribe to this channel. We put out a lot of videos that range from beginner topics to more advanced programming concepts. Also, please like this video, share it with a friend, and write a comment as well. It goes a long way to help promote a channel like this. Now, let's get back to the video. Just like Java has a class called string, it also has a class called math. This class gives you a bunch of mathematical methods that you can use. In other words, absolute value, square root, but it also has a method called random. And this method will return a double, and this will generate a random number between 0 and 1, including 0, excluding 1. Let's give it a try and see how it works in NetBeans. So here we have a class called learning random numbers. Let's create a method called print random. And this method's job will be to generate a random number and print it. So let's generate a random number using that math.random method. And now let's call this method. Let's run it and see how it works. As you can see, we have a random number, a double, between 0 and 1. Now it can be 0, but it can't be 1. Let's run this 10 times. Now, in a future video, I'm going to show you a shortcut way of doing something like this without having to duplicate this 10 times. But that's a topic for later. For now, we are calling this print random method 10 times. We should get 10 different random numbers. And there they are. So what happens if we want a random double between 0 and 2, including 0, excluding 2? Well, the random method will only return a random double between 0 and 1. So what we can do is this, multiply it by 2. What that does is it takes any number and doubles it. So instead of having a range between 0 and 1, we now have a range between 0 and 2. It will include 0 and exclude 2. So if the number that was generated was 0, we multiply it by 2, we still get 0. If the number we generated was 0.5 or a half, we multiply it by 2 and we get 1. If the number we generated was just a little bit below 1, we multiply it by 2 and we get a number just a little bit below 2. Let's try it in NetBeans and see how it looks. We're already printing the random number 10 times, so let's modify this method. And instead of math.random, it'll be math.random times 2. So now we should be getting random numbers instead of between 0 and 1. We should get some that are above 1, going up to, but not including 2. And here they are. As you can see, these numbers range between 0 and 2. This time we want a random integer between 0 and 2. We don't like those ugly doubles. We just want a nice clean number, 0 or 1. Again, a random integer between 0 and 2 will include 0, exclude 2. Now, this code here will give us a random double between 0 and 2. So what do we have to change? Well, we want this to really be an integer, so we cast it into an integer. This math.random times 2, this double, will be cast into an integer, and of course the variable that holds it will also be declared as an integer. So how does this exactly work? Well, when Java generates a random double between 0 and 2, sometimes that random double will be in this range, 0 to 1. For example, 0.215 or 0.789. In either of those cases, or in any case between 0 and 1, when we cast it into an integer, Java chops off the decimal portion and just returns the integer portion, which in this case is 0. So all random doubles between 0 and 1 will be cast into just plain 0. Similarly, any random double that gets generated between 1 and 2, 1.157, 1.96, when we cast it into an integer, the decimal portion gets chopped off and they all get changed into just plain old 1. Now keep in mind that we can include 0, but we can't include 2, Because we can't include 2, that means that we will never get an answer of 2. The biggest number we can get here is 1.999 and so on, which means we'll get an integer between 0 and 1. All right, let's try it. So we're going to change this. We're going to cast this entire quantity, math.random times 2, into an integer, and then this value will be stored into R, which also needs to be an integer. So this should generate a random integer, either 0 or 1. And there they are. We got a whole bunch of 1s, then a few zeros, then a 1, a 0, then 1, and 1. Perfect. So we've already seen how to create a random number between 0 and n. We take math.random, multiply it by n, and cast it into an integer. And that will give us a random integer between 0 and n, and of course keep in mind that it's including 0, excluding n. So really, the random numbers that are going to be generated with this statement are 0, 1, 2, all the way up to and including n minus 1. However, what happens if we want to generate a random integer between 1 and n inclusive of 1 and inclusive of n? In other words, kind of like rolling a die. A die doesn't have a 0, but it has a 6, and we want to include the 6. So how would we do that? Let's look at a diagram. Here's a diagram. It's very similar to this, except we want to chop off this section because we don't want the 0, but we want to include n, which means we need a whole new section over here up to but not including n plus 1. So then when Java chops off the decimal, it will round it down to just n. This is exactly what we want. Now notice the relationship. 0 is the lowest here, 1 is the lowest here. 1 is the second number here, 2 is the second number here. Each number is 1 more than the one above it. So we can generate the code as follows. Math.random times n, cast it into an integer just like this, but then we add 1 at the end. If we add 1 to all of these numbers, we get this, which is exactly what we want. Let's try it. So now we're going to take math.random, we'll multiply it by 6, which should give us an integer between 0 and 5 inclusive, but then at the end, we're going to add 1. So now we're going to have our random die between 1 and 6 inclusive. Let's try it. And here's the random roll. 2, 5, 6. Notice we didn't get any 1s. That's okay, it's random. Let's try it again. Now we're getting some 1s, but this time we didn't get any 2s. No problem. Looks like it's working perfectly. Time for Vegas. So in conclusion, if we want a random integer between some low value and some high value, of course, including the low value, excluding the high value, like this, here's the code. Math.random, we multiply by the range, which is high value minus low value. We cast all of that into an integer, and then we just add on the low value to bring up the minimum value, which would be 0, to low value. If you want to include the high value, like this, all you have to do is add 1. Again, the range, multiplied by math.random, cast it into an integer, and then add the low value so you can bring the 0 value up to low value. Now don't make this mistake. This code here looks at first glance like it's going to generate a random number between 1 and 100. An integer, that is, between 1 and 100. Let's try this out and see what it really does. Here's the code, and we run. Notice we're getting 1 every single time. That seems a little strange for getting a random integer between 1 and 100. I mean, it's possible we could get 1 every time, but very, very unlikely. Now, why did this fail? It failed because this multiplication is not happening first in this statement. This happens first, the casting. And when we cast math.random to an integer, remember, math.random gives us 0 point something. It could be 0, it's never going to be 1. So this is always going to be 0 when we cast it into an integer because this part gets chopped off. Then we multiply by 100. Well, 0 times 100 is just 0. And then we add 1. So this is why we're getting always the number 1. And that's a problem. How do we fix it? Don't forget the parentheses. Very common mistake. math.random times 100 must be in parentheses, then you cast it into an integer, because this piece will generate a random double between 0 and 100, including 0, excluding 100. When we cast it into an integer, that's when it chops off all the decimals, and we get the integers 0 through 99, and then finally we add 1. Let's fix it in NetBeans. Parentheses around math.random times 100. With that, we get a working program. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, there are two ways to generate random numbers. We've only covered one way, this way, math.random. And if we want to generate a random integer between some minimum and maximum value, including both, we do max minus min plus 1. We multiply that by math.random, cast it into an integer, and then we have to bring up the 0 to our minimum value, so we add min. Here's the second way. Instead of using the math class, we use the random class. Now you have to create it a little differently, and this is going to be the topic of another video, but for now, just take a look at how we do it. Random r, here's our variable. We create a new random object, and again, we'll talk about that in a future video, and then we use this variable r and call a method nextInt. That means give me the next random integer, and here's the parameter. Max minus min plus 1. This means give me a random integer between 0 and this value, including 0, excluding this value. And then we add min to it. It's basically the same math as what we do here. Now, you can generate random numbers one way. You can generate random numbers another way. Pick your preferred method. I prefer this method. Let's try an example. We want to write a method that's going to simulate the weather and print the result. So here is the specifications. There's a 40% chance of it raining, there's a 25% chance of it sleeting, and there's a 15% chance of it snowing. Anything else, in other words, the remaining 20% will have clear skies. However, if it does happen to snow, there's a 25% chance that it will be a blizzard, there's a 75% chance that it won't be a blizzard. Now I'm about to show you a hint on how you can accomplish this. If you don't want to see the hint, pause the video now and try this on your own. Okay, here's the hint. We have to somehow figure out how to do these probabilities. Now, whenever you're dealing with probabilities, it usually helps to pick a number between 1 and 100, because probability is usually based on 100%. So if we pick a random integer between 1 and 100, things should become more clear. Now, if you remember, there is a 40% chance of rain. So how do we get a 40% chance in numbers 1 through 100? Well, that's easy. 40. If we pick a random number between 1 and 100, and that number happens to be 1 through 40, well, there's your 40%, in which case it will rain. Now, if you remember, there's also a 25% chance of sleet. So how do we get 25% chance? Well, we could do it the same way. A random number between 1 and 25. The only problem is the numbers from 1 to 40 are already spoken for. Any of those numbers means it's going to rain. So we need another set of 25 numbers somewhere on this line, not including these. So what we do is we take another set of numbers from 41 all the way to 65. 41 to 65, and if this happens, we get sleet. Now, again, there are 25 numbers in here, so there's a 25% chance that one of these numbers will be chosen. There's your 25% chance of sleet. What else do we have? We have a 15% chance of snow. Well, again, we need 15 numbers somewhere on this number line, but we can't use 1 through 40, and we can't use 41 through 65. Therefore, we're going to use 66 all the way up to 80. There are 15 numbers in this range. If we pick one of these numbers, we get snow. And here's the remaining 20%. 81 through 100 will be clear. So let's write this in Java and see how it goes. So here's our method, simulate weather. And this method will generate a random number to start. So first we need an integer, r. That's going to be equal to math.random. Now remember, we want a random number, a random integer between 0 and 100. So we're going to multiply by 100. We're going to take this and we're going to cast it into an integer. That will give us an integer between 0 and 99. And then we add 1 to it to give us our number between 1 and 100. Now that we have our random number, we want to do an if statement. If r is less than or equal to 40, which means it's 1 through 40, that means we have rain. Else if r is less than or equal to 65. This is our 25% chance. Now remember, we don't have to check to see if it's greater than 40, or in other words, greater than or equal to 41, because if it was less than 41, in other words, if it was from 1 to 40, it would have already been caught in this section of the if statement, so we know that that's ruled out once we get here. So if we get to this portion of the if statement, we already know that the number is at least 41. Therefore, we only have to check the upper bound to see if it's less than or equal to 65, and if it is, we print sleet. Now for snow, we're going to check r less than or equal to 80. Again, we don't have to check the lower bound, anything 65 or below, because if it was 65 or below, it would have been caught either here or here. If we get here, the number has to be 66 or higher. Now in this case, we can't use the shortcut and print over here like this, because we're going to have multiple lines of code. And what are the multiple lines of code? Well, let's put a comment here. It is snowing. Now, we have a 25% chance that it's going to be a blizzard and a 75% chance that it's not going to be a blizzard. So the first thing we should do is we should print, it is snowing. And now we have to generate a new random number. So let's call it R2. And that's going to be, again, the same code as we have here. A random integer between 1 and 100. And a 25% chance that it's a blizzard. Well, a 25% chance means that R2 has to be less than or equal to 25. And if it is, then we will print it is a blizzard. Otherwise, we won't print anything. Now, what happens if it's not less than 80, the original number? That means we have clear skies. So we can deal with that using an else statement, and then we can print clear skies. Let's run it and see how it works. It didn't do anything. What did I forget? Well, remember, this is just a method. The only time this method will run is when we call it. I haven't called it. So we have to call simulate weather. And let's run and see how it works. This time we got sleet. What happens if we try it again? This time we got rain. In fact, let's try it 10 times and see what happens. And as you can see, we got rain twice, then sleet twice, clear sky, sleet, rain, rain, it's snowing. Oh, and it was a blizzard this time. And then it sleeted. Let's try it again. All right, this time we got snow, but notice it wasn't a blizzard. Looks like it works perfectly. I hope you learned something from watching this video. Please remember to subscribe and share this video with others who are learning Java programming. Thanks for watching, and take care, everyone.